Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Luiz Mello, and I hope you're here to learn a little bit about IBWrite. My plan is to show you a little bit about the story of how it began 5 years ago, and then go over, give you a little tour behind the stage of the teacher platform and the student platform, and then show you a little bit about how I use it. Um, I've been teaching DP Bio for the last 12 years now. I'm currently on sabbatical in Cambodia, and while my wife is teaching at the International School of Phnom Penh. And IBWrite really began in 2015 during an in-service training at the school where I was teaching at Nanjing International School. And at that time, I had a frustration with my classes, I suppose, where the students are writing very, very extensive lab reports, right? So these would take me forever to grade. Our lab report template that we used to give to students to help them out was 17 pages long. So what happened was, what I started noticing is that students that struggled really just ignored the template altogether. And the really good students kind of followed it too closely and produced reports that were very, very close to the template. So I began kind of a journey into scientific writing and how to transform the way my students are writing their lab reports specifically. I attended IBWrite, an online webinar. I think it was something like 15 hours. That was all about scientific writing in college. It was targeted at medical students, but lots of applicable things for high school kids as well. And then I began to think about how I could modify that. And the idea of IBWrite really began in January when we had a whole Thursday. We had in-service training at the school, and our only instruction was you have to create something new in one day. So this is a day kids are gone, teachers are there, free to collaborate, free to be on their own. And the only criteria was you could not mark papers, you could not rearrange your furniture. It had to be something creative, something different. So I decided to begin with my MYP students in grade 10 and ask the question of how can I create a scaffold, or what can I create that would help them write less, write more effectively, and meet the criteria better, right? Meet the assessment criteria better. And that's when this was born, right? So this is the product of a kind of 8 hours of kind of, in front of the computer and kind of making this happen. This is a 2-page PDF, and it basically breaks up the MYP criteria for B and C, so the design element and the data processing and conclusion evaluation element of the MYP format, or the MYP framework. You see that it has chunks, right? So each of those chunks is pretty much aligned to one of the elements of the criteria. And basically, I would give the students and say, fill this out kind of as an outline, right? Don't worry about writing the report yet. The way I try to sell to them was, spend 5 minutes, spend 2 hours doing this, spend 1 hour writing your report instead of spending 6 hours writing a report only, right? So it was more, I try to sell this as an outline of the report first. And you can see that there's like little YouTube icons in there. My original goal was to kind of record tutorials for each of these sections that kids could then follow on their own. And there was some traction. A lot of ELL students really loved it. In some cases, in some sort of some types of accommodation, I would actually have students submit just this and attach their graph or table together with this document, so they wouldn't have to write the full report as well. So I was able to assess this. And then I began to ask the question of how can I make this a reality for diploma students? How can I flip this writing process for diploma students as well? And it very quickly became very confusing and a kind of a big task, right? So I decided I needed some help from outside. So I found a startup accelerator in Brazil, my home country, and I asked them to help me solve this design challenge, essentially. So in April, I commissioned them to develop a minimum viable product, something that I could use with my students, that would provide basically a blended learning platform for the internal assessment. And the IBWrite has been available since July 2015. Since then, there's a lot of, hundreds of schools have used this, probably tens of thousands of students already have used IBWrite. And it was always kind of like a word of mouth kind of strategy for people to find out about IBWrite. And now with online learning or hybrid learning, I'm getting more questions about what it does, and lots of teachers actually asking, how can I help my students in this environment? And IBWrite was actually free for the first semester of this year during the pandemic, when the pandemic began, in hopes of helping teachers kind of deal with the online situation that is a reality for many schools at the moment. So this is how IBWrite began. Now let me give you a little bit of a tour of the platform from the inside. This is what the teacher panel looks like, and I will start here a tour to show you where everything is. So here first you get the assessment criteria. It's just a list of what you would find in the 7 or 8 pages of the IA criteria in the guide. This is just the highest band of each one. Then there's a compilation of all the guidance material that is within the platform. So there are a total of 12 videos that kind of flip the IA model. So you can access those from here. And then, so the platform basically consists of a teacher dashboard where you can see all of your students separated by class. And there's a student platform that the student access, right? So I'll show you that in a minute. And here you can add students manually. You can also, when you sign up, there's a link you receive that you can forward to students. It's helpful if you have like 120 students that they sign themselves up, and then you can do that via a link. Also, if you have too many students, they might be separated in different classes. So here you would filter out students just in one particular class if you have that. Then we have, you can also search by students, and each student has an icon next to it. There's a list of icons here and what they mean. So for example, if a student falls behind on one of the deadlines, a little danger icon appears there next to their name. So this kind of gives you a visual to see where each student is and kind of how they're using the platform. So they appear right next to the student's name. So this first column here indicates the class that the student is in. It lets you filter by class again. And also there's a research question column, because we find that the research question is kind of the most important thing to keep in mind throughout the writing process, right? So it's easy to see what the research question for the student is. So if you were to mouse over this, if Bob had written a research question, you would find the hover menu would come up and show you what the research question is. Next is the topic. So it shows you what the topic that the student has chosen. The IB suggests that the topics that students choose must be kind of spread out in the class. Like you wouldn't want an entire cohort writing about plants. So this gives you an indication of when students are beginning to choose the topics that they're interested in. It gives you a chance to see which students might have chosen a similar topic for you to go to them and say, these 2 topics are the same. Tell me how they're going to be different from each other. Tell me how we're going to avoid collusion. It gives you a chance to have that conversation with the students. And then each of these columns refers to each of the section of the report. Once a student has written into any of these sections, this box will be filled in. So it kind of gives you a progress bar of where the student is in the writing process. If you click on one of these boxes, you'll get what the student has actually written, right? So if I click on number 2 here, you'll see the part of the writing that the student has done. And it also gives you a chance to give feedback. So each section has a preloaded list of feedback, as well as the option for you to add your own feedback in there. When IBWrite was launched, the IB had a concern about the amount of help that this was giving to students, right? So of course, this has been on our mind from the very beginning. So we address a lot of those questions by rephrasing this in a way that is not directive. And the other thing we've done is when a student starts their platform, they get the option to write either in a formative setting or in a summative setting. So depending on which setting the student is in, this feedback changes to be more or less specific. So in the summative version, most of these are actually questions, right? So to guide the student in thinking and reflecting about what the student needs to do. And let me show you now the student side of things. So this is more or less kind of structured like a scientific report. So you have, it goes from title to references, going through evaluation, including the typical parts you'd find in a lab report. In each of these sections, what you'd find, actually, let me start the tour here on this side as well. So at the very beginning, it gives students a note to say, before you begin, click here. And what that video does is it kind of talks to students through the idea of choosing the investigation, right? So where to look for inspiration. It absolutely, none of these videos will tell the students what to write, right? So the idea is not to say you need to write these things, but really to give questions to get students unstuck when they're working from home. This is the kind of the number one feedback we got from students when we were in the research stages of IBWrite, is that most of the writing happens at home. And that's when students have the least support, right? They don't have a student or a teacher, ready to answer their questions. So the videos were really designed to get students unstuck when they're writing. Students can actually use IBWrite for chemistry, biology, and physics. So if students take more than one science discipline, they can switch the discipline up at the top, so they can write one report in each of the disciplines at the same time. When the internal candidate or individual candidate cover sheet was a thing, students would add their information here, and IBWrite will actually help them or help teachers by exporting all of those cover sheets at once. So here's where the student would select a topic, and then in each of the sections, whenever they click on it, a window will pop up and kind of give them a chance to work on that chunk of the report. So in a lot of ways, it works like that MYP outline that I mentioned, right? So it gives the student, like it removes everything else from the field of view of the student, so that there's no distractions about looking at the graph or looking at the student is just focused on one thing at a time. And within this, the student will see the deadline for that particular section, which is set by the teacher, and also how-to video and a PDF with exercises or notes that might guide the student in a written format. So we find that sometimes students prefer to watch somebody talk to them. Sometimes they prefer to just scan some text. So those two options are there. Because we introduced a in-text citation feature about 2 years ago, each of these sections that might be prone to have citations in them, there's this references required section to say, there's probably going to be a citation in here, watch this video to know how to cite it. So again, that citation is walking the student not through a particular style, but just through the notion of why it's important to cite, what kinds of things should be cited, and it doesn't actually give them a format. In fact, when one of the things we found also is that when students work on citations, is that they would write, and then perhaps just before they complete their IA, they would go back and reference everything, right? Or reference the things that they need to reference. And that's very counterproductive. So we introduced a feature where they can actually just insert a citation, just a number and the link. IBWrite enters the date of the citation automatically. And then the student can go back to it later, access the link, and get the rest of the information to cite the work correctly. Then the other feature that IBWrite has, especially useful for very large cohorts, is the possibility to request materials and to request lab time. So the student can click here, a list comes up of the materials and quantities and things that they might need, and that gets sent to the teacher's email. Once the student is finished, all they have to do is export the document, and this is going to spit out either actually a Word file. And one of the things that we're very, very concerned about is that we don't want IBWrite to format the paper for the student. So what they'll get really is just each of these windows where they typed information into spit out into a Word document with very little formatting to be done. So it's up to the student to then say, How do I format my introduction? Where are the paragraphs? How do I format my method, and so on. So the method, for example, is really only about ordering the steps and making sure each of the steps is about a variable, right? So it instructs the students on how to do that. And then when the document is exported, we recommend that they go back and actually write it out in paragraphs form if that's what they want to do. So IBWrite can be used many times as the student and the teacher wants. So there's a reset button to erase everything and start anew. Only one report can be written at a time. So the student cannot have 2 bio reports at once. And because of the formal feedback from the written feedback on the students, that can happen through IBWrite as well. So if a student is finished writing, they can click draft finish. That will trigger a warning for the teacher on the teacher dashboard, and then the teacher can go in and offer some feedback, right? So the draft process can happen within IBWrite as well. Some teachers prefer to actually have students print it out, almost like a finished version, like a draft, a first draft, and then annotate the word like you would, and then go from there. So in some cases, teachers work within IBWrite only up until the draft, right? And then everything after the draft, they just annotate and the student fixes on their own. And then the deadline field, which is over here on the right, is what's going to show the final deadline to the students. So like if, when the paper has to be submitted, and the next deadline, which is the chunked deadlines that the teacher can set, right? To make sure that students are kind of managing smaller portions of the project instead of the whole thing at once. So that's the student platform. And I just want to show you, the last thing I want to show you before I open up for questions is how I use this with my classroom. So when I deploy IBWrite and how exactly I use it. So let me open this up. So I use IBWrite really, so ironically, actually, most of the teachers, most of the schools that use IBWrite subscribe for their seniors, right? So most of the when they're writing the summative work for the IB, right? So the summative work. I actually use IBWrite mostly in grade 11. So again, the idea behind it was for me to kind of offset the writing process to home, so that they can work on their own pace. They can work with as many or as few distractions as they need to, and of course, it frees up class time for me to get through the content. So what I do in the first year, in fact, very early in the first semester of the first year, is in the osmosis in plant tissues, one of the required practicals actually. We use, I separate students into 2 teams, and then each team is responsible for half of the data collection. But the purpose of that mock IA for me in the first semester is to talk a little bit about collaboration, so how scientists collaborate, how to document things during the lab. I don't particularly teach journaling to my students. I'm not a big fan of science journals, but I do show them at this stage how to keep track of your qualitative observations, how to keep track of things that are happening while you're collecting data. I also use this as an introduction to databases. You'll see that the work that they do actually feeds into a database. And then, of course, being the first one, it becomes a big introduction to what the IA is about. So the experimental design looks a little bit like this. I have them carry out as a big class. Actually, as a class of about 18 students. I have them carry out 2 big sets of data collection. So they use cork borers, they make potato cylinders, they cut them up in 3 different lengths. They collect 5 trials for each of the experiments, and then they do 5 different NaCl concentrations plus the control, and then 5 different sucrose concentrations plus the control. So once they collect all of this, they actually feed each time they collect 1 trial, they use a form to submit it into a database. So when it's time for them to actually write the IA, so when they finish collecting all this data, I would go then and say, here's the database, here's all the data points that we've collected. You have to go now and ask a question of this database and write your IA about it. So, and then at that point, they have seen pretty much zero about the mechanics of writing the IA. We talked about ideas, we talked about how practicals like the microscopy lab, how how an IA is thought of, but nothing about the mechanics. All that I do is I get this data that they've collected, these 180 some data points, and I say, ask a question and then write an IA. And part of that is to kind of, because IBWrite has all of the videos that they need to kind of get an idea of how to write each of the sections. The other part that I like to kind of begin to point to at this stage is the idea that when they get stuck beyond what the videos can help them with, that's when they go to a friend or they come to me for help. So this doesn't become, what I really like about this idea is that it doesn't become me teaching a lesson about writing the IA when I might have 4 students that don't need it. I might have a big group that kind of gets it, and I have 2 or 3 kids that desperately need help one-on-one. So this kind of frees up a lot of that middle group time to get them moving along. So this happens in year 1. In semester 1, the deadline for this is about beginning of October. So it's a very, very, very early in the DP. In the second semester, they write a second mock IA. The focus on this one moves a little bit to the idea of the individual nature of the IA. So the idea of coming up with a research question on their own and kind of exploring an interest on their own. I'm a big fan of sensors. I really like using them. So I want to make sure that they are experienced with using sensors. Of course, we use a bunch of those during the course of the development of skills in the course as well. But I want them to be confident enough in collecting data for a project so that if they choose to use a sensor for their IA in the following semester, that they know how to use them, they know how to manage them for a long period of time, they know how to store them, how to connect them, and everything else. And invariably, one of the sensors being a heart rate monitor, a student wants to explore some sort of human physiology experiments. So this gives me a chance to bring up again the animal experimentation policy. So these are kind of these are the 3 focuses, I guess, of this second mock IA. So basically what I tell them is that I give them a list of the sensors that we carry at the school. And we say, you have to ask a question that is solved by using one of these sensors. One of the nice things about doing that is that sensors typically come with a manual, and the method is pretty much half written for them. So they have, they know how to use the sensor from reading the manual. So it kind of removes a lot of pressure from the method section as well. If you've been teaching diploma biology or diploma science for more than 6 years, you'll remember the old syllabus. The current IA is a big departure from what the IA used to be back then. And one of the reasons behind it was the idea of individuality of the student, right? So it's no longer the teacher prescribing what labs they're going to do, and then it's not the teacher prescribing what they're going to do and assessing the highest scores. It's now a completely individual investigation. And the vision, I suppose, is one of a mentor and a mentee, right? So something like a student writing a thesis in college or writing a thesis in their doctorate and having a supervisor, having a mentor to discuss that thesis with. That's kind of the relationship that works really well with the IA between the student and the teacher. And the other part is the research, right? So the idea of, I have this question, I know maybe close to nothing about it, and where do I begin the research to become familiar with the topic enough that I can inquire into it? So that's kind of the idea. So even though human physiology at this point is pretty much about a year away for the students, they still get to explore it because they can do the research and learn the bits they need to understand their questions. The experimental design for this one varies, it really depends on what the sensor and what the question the student is asking. Usually it ends up being a 2x5x5, right? So 2 variations of 5 treatments of an independent variable and 5 trials. This could be, this gives me a chance to actually talk also about the personal engagement component, right? So personal engagement being more than just, I really like potatoes, therefore I'm going to write a lab on catalase, and becoming more about, here's an investigation that I did, here are the results that I got, now I have more questions. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to do this other investigation. That's what the 2 in the front could be. So it gives the students a chance to think about what that personal engagement might look like. And if you're familiar with vernier sensors, that's the sensor that we used in Nanjing, and they're great, right? So Pasco also works great, and there's a lot of actually some other kind of free, not free necessarily, but kind of more more accessible sensors as well that can be used. And then in the first semester of year 2, that's when the summative IA happens. Sometimes, I don't think it's actually happened in the last 3 or 4 years. If a student really wants to write another one for practice, they can. Usually it eats up into the time of their other IAs and everything else that's happening in grade 12 or the year 2 of the diploma. So most of them choose to go straight into the summative IA. And at that point, the work is minimum in terms of having them write it, because they've already gone through 2 rounds of feedback. They've gone through 2 investigations. They've watched the videos. They know what to do at this point. From what I really like about this setup is that when this begins, it's really a question about, Mr. Mello, I have this is what I think I'm going to investigate. Do you see any problems? Do you see any roadblocks? Anything I might need to change? Conversations like the one I had with a student who wanted to do a catalase lab. And I said, well, catalase is very simplistic. It's one of our required practicals. We did that in class. So how are we going to mix this up? How are you going to change this? So his response was that he wanted to basically calibrate an IGCSE lab that uses catalase in potatoes, hydrogen peroxide, and soap, right? And measures the height of bubbles in the test tube. And he said, I want to actually calibrate that lab to see if a student in IGCSE could, for example, look at my calibration curve and actually looking at the height of the bubbles, know how much oxygen is being produced. So I thought that's a brilliant idea, because you're going to have to do the lab for using a sensor to quantify the oxygen. You're going to have to do the lab as the IGCSE students do to create the other curve. And you can compare the 2, right? So connect the 2. So it's a great example of personal engagement that student did. That began really from that conversation with the student at the start. We have pretty much short turnover for the IA. So students write the IA from August to October, or from October to January, depending on which class they're scheduled in. If they take 2 sciences, for example, they would write chemistry August to October, and they might write biology October to January. So this turnaround actually allows us to include the IA grade as part of the semester grade for semester 1 of year 2.